Dr. Paul Farmer, author of his latest Fever, Feuds, and Diamonds, Ebola and the Ravages of History. It is a real pleasure to welcome you to the program. Dr. Farmer, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I wanted to mention that you are the Cole Catronis University Professor and Chair of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard University, but I was afraid I couldn't pronounce it. So I want to give you a crack at it.
It's phonetic. It's a lovely couple who gave the award, and their name is pronounced Colocatronis, like phonetic.
Okay, well, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And I want to start before I get into your book with, and I think this is going to address some of the topics in your book, but social medicine. Forgive me being so rudimentary, but what does that mean?
Well, in the book, I called it a regrettably obscure branch of the profession, which is a line I lifted out of Tolkien.
That's funny. Well, so
I read that in fifth grade, and it stuck with. I then memorized the whole damn trilogy. How's that for nerdy? Social medicine
the Hobbit's usually the one people read, but the whole.
Oh no, Hobbits for wimps. Social medicine used to be a big deal in the 19th century when people were, acknowledging the impact of social disparities, racism, rapid urbanization, the usual, on health and well-being, and particularly of poor people. And, it kind of got obscure as the promise of biomedicine exploded in the 20th century. But it still always tries to get at that question: who lives, who dies, how come? And that's kind of how I try to use it in my practice and in my teaching and in this book. How did I do, Sam?
That's very helpful, because I think, that is in many respects a huge portion of your book here, at least, and I think also obviously indicative of your other books as well. Well, let's talk about this. So the book is I guess part ethnography, maybe part history, and then part about social medicine. And let's start with that ethnography. You went to West Africa to help deal with the Ebola epidemic that started there. And tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book. I know that it came from sitting down with folks who had with a couple of people that you dedicated a significant amount of time to, who had survived Ebola but had their families and their social networks had been devastated by it.
Right. Well, first of all, I would add that I don't think that I really conducted ethnography in the classic sense. There you learn a language. You're, what they even call them field languages in anthropology. And, you spend a couple years just sitting and learning about people's lives. And I, of course, was invited there as a doctor, not as an anthropologist. So the ethnography, if there is one, was more a critical look at my own peers, the public health people. It's not a very flattering look, I know, but that's really where the ethnography occurred. For the garden variety ethnography, I really relied on the published work of anthropologists and social historians. So it's not in any snobby anthropology sense, a classic ethnography, but hey, that's not why I was there.
Right.
And so I spent, most of my time working on clinical endeavors. But the idea itself for the book, as you point out, came from one of those former patients, Ibrahim, who, to my surprise, asked me to interview him. And that never happens.
Yeah, well, tell us about Ibrahim's story, because you dedicate a chapter, or I should say two, between Ibrahim and Yobam. Yobam. And so tell us their stories and how that led you through this journey, I guess, of telling the broader story of Ebola and its the foundations, I guess, of the way that of the response.
The two of them were had very different experiences, as you might imagine. One was a 26-year-old without children of his own at the time, and the other was a 37 or 8-year-old mom. And both of them just had devastating losses. Ibrahim told me that more than 20 members of his family had died, during or shortly after Ramadan, which is, a month. And, I just sat there, my mouth probably, my jaw on my chest. It's a very unusual thing for an infectious pathogen to take out that many members of a family. And for Yabom, it was a similar story, but she also lost her children and her spouse. And that's very hard to hear even as a clinician. And usually, if you're seeing patients, you don't spend hours, and certainly not years, talking to people about their experience. Maybe we should, but nobody has time for that. So, carving time out to really learn about their stories was important to me. And I always start at the beginning and say, where were you born and how did you grow up? And that's not the kind of conversation that happens easily in a clinical setting, in a hospital or a Ebola treatment unit. Certainly we didn't have time to really talk about anything. So those conversations unfurled over time after that initial exchange with Ibrahim when he asked me to interview him. When I say, Sam, that that's not something that happens very often, certainly if you work in the United States or in Haiti, patients are going to want to talk. They're going to want to talk to you about their experience. But to have someone ask you to interview him after that kind of experience, that was new for me after 30 years of being a doctor and anthropologist.
Why do you think he? I mean, what was it that? I mean, why do you think he wanted you to interview him? Why, both? Why do you think he wanted to be interviewed, and why do you think he wanted you to interview him?
Well, as chance would have it, I had interviewed the other patients or recovering patients who were present that evening, and I had started this tradition. It became a tradition of gathering socially with Ebola survivors, which at the height of the epidemic, there were all kinds of predictions. It was in this rather beaten down hotel called the Mama Yoko, which I kind of made a character in the book. It's advertised as a luxury beachfront hotel, but I can't say much about the beach, not having had time to frequent it, and I don't know about the luxury part. But we just started having these dinners, and I had learned this in Haiti as a physician, a young physician in Haiti. People with chronic ailments that are life-threatening, they bond over their illness experience. And if we nurses and doctors are lucky, they bond with us too. So this was not a new experience for me in incorporating survivors, those most directly afflicted by whatever kind of problem we were talking about, be it AIDS or tuberculosis, or in this case, Ebola. It was familiar to me, that approach. That's how you learn a lot of things you would never learn. Even clinical matters come to the fore. Hidden clinical matters come to the fore when you start talking with survivors and their experience. So I knew I wanted to do that, but I didn't know I wanted to write a book until after the exchanges with Ibrahim.
And you said two things I'm curious about. What did you find clinically from talking to those folks? A, and B, why is it surprising to have that many people in a family die of in the context of an infectious disease?
And I didn't answer your other question either. Why did he ask me? Part of it was that he knew that I had interviewed those other patients about their experience, and could have been that. I mean, I'm certainly not going to credit my own wonderful storytelling abilities, but whatever the reason was, I was very grateful that he did. The sort of things that you can uncover are not the clinical matters you can uncover are around the sequelae, as they're called in medicine, of the infection. So if you go back into the medical literature and study these viruses, they're called filoviruses, or used to be, you'll see that they're, in the rare instances in which the experience of people was actually followed up, You'll find that people had visual loss, blindness, seizures, and in the heat of the epidemic and inside an Ebola treatment unit, um, everybody was just scrambling to try and keep people alive. And too little attention was paid to what happened after they left the Ebola treatment unit. So those are the sorts of things that make a difference. And in the case of Yabom, the youngish woman who lost her children and spouse and mother and many others, she was one of those people who was facing visual loss, and that's readily treated. So those are the kind of reasons that you really want to get to know patients even after they leave your care for their acute disease. I learned a great deal, and am still learning a great deal by talking to the survivors, by staying in touch with them, by maintaining relationships with them. Now, why infectious pathogens don't take out whole families? They're not even reliably. They don't even reliably cause the same illness inside a family, and you can see that with COVID-19 as well, right? Some people, particularly elderly people and those with comorbid conditions, do poorly, but you also see sometimes perfectly healthy people, young people, even children die of COVID. So that kind of variability is very characteristic of most infectious pathogens, including those caused by virus, like both COVID-19 and Ebola are. And you really don't usually see everybody getting the same grievous illness and everybody facing the same risk of dying with any of these pathogens. And that's one of the sort of myths about Ebola, that it always causes severe disease, that it could never cause asymptomatic illness. Those things prove to be false, as with other pathogens. There are rare exceptions, Sam, like rabies. Rabies is devastating and usually lethal among everyone. But the great majority of viruses, bacteria, and parasites that cause disease in humans cause a very wide spectrum of disease.
And I want to get to, you talk about those myths surrounding Ebola in terms of survival too, and obviously a big part of your book is to talk about outcomes, differing outcomes, as a function of where you are socially and economically. But let me ask you before we move on to that part about it, and I want to talk a little bit about the history, obviously, that because you dedicated a huge portion of your book to how you get to a point where the certain sort of where some of the response to Ebola, for instance, and we can also see the parallels with coronavirus, are structural. But I want to just curious in terms of did you learn anything in terms of the idea of having survived a pandemic or an epidemic in terms of maybe predicting how individuals, but also society reacts following a pandemic?
Yeah. There is a huge literature on this, but it's mostly written by historians, right? Because social historians and medical historians, because in the thick of the epidemic, there's enormous confusion and fear. Again, those are standard features of being in the middle of an epidemic or a pandemic. And that's well described too. And of course, we all felt that and are feeling it now around COVID-19. But there are also reliably demonstrated social responses beyond fear and confusion. And in what I saw with Ebola was that efforts to contain the disease were trumping efforts to care for the afflicted, right? And that, of course, was resonant to me because I'd seen it before. I'd seen it across that continent in the post-colonial setting. I knew it was related to a public health paradigm that lessened the value of Black lives. There's book after book, study after study. I knew that, but I never really had studied it or written about it at great length, as much as it disturbed me to see this control over care paradigm. And the classic example, which you've discussed before, is around AIDS, right? Because to develop an effective suppressive therapy for the leading infectious killer of adults, young adults in the world, and then decree that it was not cost effective, feasible, sustainable to use in Africa, the most affected continent, was very familiar to us. And we saw it with every other pandemic as well. So the general point that I would make, Sam, is that epidemics and pandemics always reveal a great deal about the social pathologies. So
Right.
why would you give all the credit to the virus, right? It's the unequal social conditions that determine both risk for the infection and then risk for bad outcomes or good outcomes for some among the afflicted. And that's another staple of everybody who writes about social responses to pandemics or epidemics. You see it again and again.
And this paradigm of control over care, it functions both within the context of within a society, but also, in between, a broader society. So, in other words, and this is what, and you write, obviously, you write about this quite a bit, is heading to West Africa and seeing that the idea is less to provide for the patients who are suffering and more to make sure that this doesn't get outside of West Africa.
There was no question. Even if you were only seeing patients, you could sense this, right? But if you were also involved in discussing policy, international or global responses, funding to address, to water the clinical desert, if you were doing that, you got it all day long. That the real priority here is containment. And if there's a second priority, it's to protect healthcare professionals. And there were so few of them already that they couldn't possibly be the primary caregivers for those afflicted. And the primary caregivers were traditional healers and family members, right? So you had the first priority being containment, the second being protect the healthcare professionals. And then the third, if it was all too rarely a priority at all, was to make sure the afflicted survived. So that's really an inversion of the idealized social contract that we have with physicians and nurses. The idea that we have embraced, and I think it's embraced all over the world, is that the priority is to take care of the patient in front of you. But that was not the story with this epidemic, nor with other epidemics of Ebola or a related pathogen called Marburg, because they happen in Africa where the natives, as they are still called to this day, by the way, the natives are less important than protecting the surrounding world, and particularly the rich white world, the post-colonial world. So that was familiar to me, but this time I tried to, dig deeper into the roots of that paradigm. And by the way, I would say that is not the paradigm that's at play here in the United States around COVID. What we're seeing here is not control over care. We're seeing a kind of containment nihilism where you have the senior administration, the leadership of the central administration of the United States saying, we're not going to do contact tracing. We're not going to be able to control this, or we're only going to do so after we have a vaccine. And of course, that has meant and will continue to mean ongoing loss of life from COVID-19. So either side of those imbalances we need to address, but the ones we see in the post-colonial world are almost always control over care.
Yeah, I want to get into that because I was going to say the administration is the complete inverse, of course, except for the implications of that lack of containment, except for the care. That level of care seems to end outside of their circle. And so the only thing that sort of leaks out of that circle is the lack of containment and then the implications of that spill over. But I want to talk about just some of the aspects of, because you talk about the hundreds of years of extraction from this area, starting, with the slave trade, working through commodities like latex, wood, diamonds, and how does that how does that extraction, or how does that create the structures that inhibit the ability to provide for care and for just a response in for an epidemic?
Well, that ended up being, as you can tell, the real question I wanted to ask is, how do you create a medical desert? And a medical desert is a clinical desert. That is, there are not people to take care of you, who are certainly not those who are well trained and well protected, right? But it's also a public health desert, right? So you don't have the surveillance capacity. And to do those things, both the clinical and public health objectives, to meet those objectives, you have to have staff, stuff, space, and systems. So the question becomes, how does extractive colonialism remove the possibility for having the right staff, stuff, space, and systems? And some people aren't interested in that, or don't have the patience for it. And it's certainly not the question we were asking in the middle of the epidemic.
Right.
But it's an important question nonetheless. And, a friend of mine who's now a household figure, Tony Fauci, a mentor of mine, when he read a draft of this last year, he was saying, this book is 5 inches thick, printed out, double spaced or double sided. And, you spend so much time on the history, and I got that quite a bit, but I came to feel that it was the historical underpinnings of this desiccation and creation of a medical desert that interested me most. And the things that I thought, if you're going to write about people like Ibrahim and Yabom, then you need to understand how they got into these dire straits, ones in which they would lose such a large number of their family members to this disease, which claimed the lives of 0 white Americans, as you know, and very few Europeans either.
What are the broad structures of that? Because, one of the things, I feel like it is analogous, but not nearly, obviously, the dynamic is very different. But in New York State, for instance, over the course of the past 10 years, we've had a closure of nearly 20% of the public hospitals. We've seen a diminution of resources to those hospitals, and we can track the deaths of people in that big, in March, April, May in New York. And we can see that aligns with where resources have been distributed or not. And there's obviously a huge economic and class component to both deaths and contractions within the context of New York State, anyways. And so there's a slight analogy, right? I mean, obviously you set a context, but how does this extraction, I guess maybe you tell me if it's best sort of exemplified by the fact that, a complete absence of, or not complete, but an absence of latex gloves in a place that you couldn't have more latex, really, when we talk about West Africa.
Well, the thing that probably rolled out the red carpet for Ebola in that part of West Africa, which, as some people call Upper West Africa, is probably civil war, right? But the wars were fought over the extractive trades. That's why they call them blood diamonds, the diamonds from Sierra Leone. And, Liberia is used to be the United States really latex plantation. And that was Firestone that set that up almost 100 years ago with a famous 99-year-long lease of something like 1 million acres. I mean, this is a huge endeavor. And so there are the ironies, right? Here we're getting diamonds that are blooded, and here in a place where there's so much latex you could swim in it, the nurses and doctors called to respond to Ebola don't even have latex gloves. But, looking back at the history, first of all, just to, stick with the example of Liberia, which is, the oldest independent republic on the continent by many accounts, and it was founded by Americans, Black Americans, at least its coastal reaches. By the time I had set foot in Liberia, some people estimated that there were fewer than 50 practicing physicians, clinically active physicians in the country. And, just doing the math, you could say, well, that would be like having 6 doctors in the city of Boston. And, I can't walk 5 feet in the Brigham and Women's Hospital and not bump into 5 of my colleagues who are physicians. It's just crazy, this disparity. So then you start looking back and saying, well, what about training nurses and doctors in this part of West Africa? And you find out that in the European colonies of Guinea and Sierra Leone, the French and the British didn't even bother founding a single medical school in those countries. And in fact, in Sierra Leone, the oldest European colony in that part of the world, British colony, not only was there no medical school founded before they left in 1963, I was alive already, but they didn't found a nursing school either. And they took the trouble in 1902 to ban Black doctors from the Colonial Medical Service. So those are the kind of details that make a big difference down the line when you start talking about where's the staff, the stuff, the space and systems to respond to, Ebola, without even talking about outmigration of professionals like experienced nurses to the UK, the United States, other places where they end up. So I thought that was an important part of the history to know, to understand not only why this place is a medical desert, but what we could do to irrigate it. Is it some mysterious cultural problem? No, it's, as you said, these are structural problems. And that means they need to be addressed structurally as well.
And ultimately that means for you reparations to come in and I guess to build those infrastructures, right? I mean, to like you say, irrigate them, I guess, those deserts and create the infrastructures to essentially catch up on some level of those literally hundreds of years that they missed in developing these type of medical infrastructures.
I'm perfectly comfortable with the term reparations. In my line of work, you need reparative action to train the staff, buy the stuff, develop the clinical spaces, and put in place the systems. I mean, some of the systems we're talking about aren't just infection control, which is a systems approach, like, for example, involves PPE, respiratory precautions, contact precautions, the kind of things that are now the subject of public discussion in the United States. But it also means the systems required to pay people regularly. I mean, I met nurses, including a couple who died of Ebola, who hadn't been paid in a year or 2 years. And the answer was always, the reasons given were always the same: we don't have the resources. And, that's pretty hard to stomach, if you're in the middle of a part of Sierra Leone where diamond production is happening round the clock just 5 miles away. And so we need to link this extraction, not just that which is going on now, which is pretty substantial, but to understand what it has cost people who live in that part of the world to have been subjected to this steady drumbeat of extraction for so long. I mean, I'd be hard pressed to think of any other place in the world where it's been going on that long and when sustained over that amount of time. As you said, from slaves to gold and diamonds to latex, wood, all the treasures on top of the earth and those just under it. So yeah, we need reparative action. And, that's going to involve things like building stronger hospital systems, putting proper training in place so that they do have the staff they need, and thinking about what kind of infusions of resources, including capital, are required to build up health systems in that part of the world.
What I think is fascinating about your work is that those lessons obviously apply both, within those societies to other institutions and other, outside of medicine. I mean, obviously, they're interrelated in terms of like infrastructure in a country just writ large is going to implicate, obviously, health outcomes. But that's also a dynamic that can be applied in other countries. And
just to take our own, as you pointed out, we have not only not invested in public health, but we've divested from public health. So any effort to understand the reasons, plural, for which we've done so spectacularly poorly in responding to COVID-19 are going to have to take account of that divestment, right? And, I think most people involved in the press for reparations in the United States, the American descendants of slaves, would not be keen to hear us use the term to describe needed investments in public health, or public education, or public transportation, or public anything. Those discussions are often about, since 40 acres and a mule, are often about the private reparative action to the descendants of those who had been enslaved. And I get that entirely. We also need much, much broader reparative action around this, the safety net of this country, including its public health apparatus. And the return on our investments in basic science research, every American who's going to get a vaccine should marvel at that. But we've been done very poorly investing in a national health care delivery system that can, be a safety net for everyone. So we need it here as well.
What other, is that, obviously those are lessons derived from our response. What else? I'm curious if in your response to epidemics in the past, you've seen anything analogous to the idea that, obviously the administration has sort of been, like I think you said, nihilistic in terms of containment. But have you ever seen this level of sort of denial? We have 300,000 Americans dead. We're going to have more than likely and at least 100,000 more before this is over. Have you seen anything that's even remotely analogous to this type of societal response?
Well, I think part of the reason I would say no, I have not, is because I am an American and I was born here and raised here, and spend much of my time as a doctor and a teacher here. Of course, that's my day job. So part of this affective, component of it is that it's striking so close to home. And that's when compared to other pandemics that we've seen, for example, cholera. I've been in the thick of not one cholera pandemic, but two. And, the United States wasn't spared entirely when the largest one, until very recently, erupted in Haiti, right? Of course, cases ended up in Florida and Texas and other border states, but it's not like it became out of control anywhere. The closest to that for me would be HIV, which came along when I was just beginning my medical studies. So, there's another affective component. When I was doing my medical school rotations, my clinical rotations, AIDS was far and away the leading killer of young adults in this country. So our teaching hospitals in Boston were full of people who were dying of AIDS, but I also got to see them stop dying of AIDS when we developed new tools to treat them. But this experience has really been, for me, unprecedented, to see such a rich and an egalitarian country as ours do so poorly. And of course, part of the reason is because of the inegalitarian nature of our country. Another is the divestment from public health. And another is the nature of our public health system, which is very patchwork, like our political system, like our administrative systems. Whereas in Rwanda, the only place I've spent a significant amount of time during the COVID epidemic, their response was so much better and was reflected in very small numbers of cases and even and really tiny numbers of deaths. And that was in part because they did have a national program, not just a national COVID response program, but a national healthcare delivery system that could provide standardized, services, including preventive services that will be relevant even more with the vaccine, but also contact tracing. I have little doubt that at one point in this epidemic, Rwanda, which has 12 million population, had as many contact tracers as we did in the entire United States.
Wow.
It's just, we have been slow on the uptake with a lot of reasons. And again, that gets us back to the leadership question.
And those structural forces. I mean, we just don't have the pipes in some way to fill, to send out what we need to send out, whether that's, healthcare or even resources to get people to behave in such a way that they protect themselves. We don't have any of that infrastructure.
And you know that from your own work in the media, how splintered that is. But it's you can see the analogies, across the board. That's cost us a lot. But I would add that, if you look at the stimulus bills or the COVID response bills that have managed to wend their way through Congress, and they're very few in number, very little of that money went to public health. Right. So again, that seems like really a bad idea in the middle of a public health crisis to skip over investments in public health. And so we still need to do that now. We're going to have to, print money. Governments can do that. But we're going to have to do something to get those resources into the public health system and the safety net.
Hope springs eternal. Dr. Paul Farmer, Fever, Feuds, and Diamonds, Ebola, and the Ravages of History. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll put a link to that book at majority.fm. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam. It's a real pleasure to be on the show.